Right, hello, welcome to the meeting of the Climate Emergency Policy and Scrutiny Committee. I think I have to start by declaring where emergency exits are and things, don't I? I'm always a bit tricky on this one. So the toilets are just there and the emergency exit for members of the public is that way. Is it also the emergency exit for councillors? Yes. So we all go that way in the unusual event of something happening. So that was that bit. Declarations of interest. Does anyone want to declare anything? I'm not seeing anything. So then we move on to the minutes of the last meeting. Am I allowed to sign these as a true record of what we discussed? Again, I'm not seeing any dissent, so I will sign that. Thank you. And then we move on to public participation. So we've got two registered speakers. The first is Debbie Cobbett. Welcome, Debbie. You've got 3 minutes to address us.
Right in the middle.
Sorry?
Right in the middle.
Yeah.
Right, thank you, Chair. From your minutes, I'd like to repeat what I said about the York Climate Commission's very limited membership and suggest once more that they should include other groups and organisations, and in particular, trade unions. From their website, actually, they appear to have been idle since November 2021, the date of their last meeting. But I'd like to make some points about contributions that trade unions can make to climate action. Firstly, we have a great deal to offer in terms of awareness of the jobs needed to tackle the climate emergency. I have more copies of the Climate Jobs book to give to you. Not business as usual jobs with a bit of greenwash, but jobs to create warm homes, renewable energy, better public transport, better food, regenerative agriculture, biodiversity, and so on. Not to mention the need for better health, education, care, other public services for local residents. That's why we recommend the Climate Jobs book, to build a workforce to address the climate emergency, not for the sake of growth, however green, but to create useful jobs that will benefit workers and local communities. To me, that would seem to be an essential part of forward planning that's missing from the Council's 10-year plans for health, climate and the economy. Trade unions, a whole bunch of them, including mine, have already produced a heatwave protocol, which seems relevant to updating your draft climate risk report to understand the totality of risks, including impact on the workforce. Who better to understand them than the people that are working in overheated schools and such like? And with the Climate Jobs book, I have to say the trade union that seemed to understand this most immediately was the FBU, Fire Brigade Union. Fire and rescue being one of the most crucial of services. So I would suggest that moving through the tiers on the climate adaptation journey, from just starting to mainstreaming climate adaptation across all services, should include just that, all local services and the input of trade unions. If we're good enough for the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission, why not for the York one? And I also think you need to go further and faster in listening to health workers. It's of course important to hear about adaptation and resilience on the current agenda. But having gone beyond safe limits in terms of carbon emissions long ago, the world needs to prepare for all kinds of events and, a lot more than flooding. In York Environment Week 2021, we held an event with local doctors. What has the climate crisis got to do with our health?
You have 30 seconds, just to let you know, Debbie.
Their key message was failing to plan means you're planning to fail. And key points for York went beyond, this was a local MedAct group, beyond immediate flood risks, impacts of heat stress, pressures on emergency services already stretched beyond safe levels, polluted air and water causing diseases, forced migration from rising sea levels with climate refugees coming this way from East Yorkshire needing to be rehoused, pandemics, mental health impacts associated with all of the above. Now, we're not addressing that stuff even now. So my main point today is listen to the workers and read the Lancet countdown reports, because they're ace on all the health impacts and the risks associated with climate change.
Thank you for that. Can I ask you if you can leave that heatwave protocol for members? Can you leave the copy of the heatwave protocol you referred to? Thank you. Excellent, thank you. And before I call the second speaker, I'd also just point out that this committee has repeatedly also asked for trades union representation on the Climate Commission.
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
This committee has repeatedly asked exactly the same question as you have asked for trades union representation on the Climate Commission. Okay, thank you. So I'll call on our second speaker, Jeff Beacon, if I may. And I'll remind you before you start, it's 3 minutes. Okay. We'll need to press your microphone. And you'll need your microphone between you and your face.
Is that fine now?
Yeah.
Sorry, the hearing's going a bit. The comment I want to make about BioYorkshire are these. Clearly, climate comes into their considerations a lot, and saving the environment and persuading their the businesses that have signed up for them to be more climate friendly. But I think they ought to go further than looking at their existing pattern of business and say, what can we do to push this along a bit? I think that there's some analysis needed of the regulatory framework that surrounds businesses and try and get them to understand how regulations could be changed, which would mean that as profit maximizing businesses, they could be encouraged to do better. Drax is one example. Drax gets a lot of stick even in the Murdoch press for places that they source their biomass from. And I don't know the details of that, but I do know they once sourced biomass from local willow growers, and that, I would guess, that's rather more environmentally friendly than shipping them across the Atlantic from what are claimed to be fairly mature forests in America. But the question is, how can they change? They're obviously doing this strategy because it's good for them, bottom line. But BioYorkshire ought to be asking them, how can we change the law or the regulatory framework to make it worthwhile you doing something more environmentally friendly? Perhaps with the meat producers in BioYorkshire, I don't know whether it's more difficult. I know the Science seems to talk a lot about eating insects, which is, we've got to do that, and we've got to cut down a lot on meat consumption, but try and find ways of making people like Cranswick have profitable businesses which don't rely heavily on beef and lamb and pork. So I would hope that BioYorkshire gets some good environmental economists in. Perhaps they've got some already, but
You've got about 30 seconds left. Just
if they have, give them wider scope to think, so that they can press the government into making, or in the Drax example, for example, making it more profitable to source from local farms in Yorkshire than places in Louisiana and Canada. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And your thoughts are going to be added to our considerations, I'm sure. Okay, we'll move on to the other agenda items. Before we do so, I didn't declare, which I should have done, that of course this is being webcast so that everyone is aware that it's a public meeting. And secondly, I propose to move things around so that agenda item 8 comes after agenda item 4, unless anyone has any reservations or concerns, just to move things around a bit. I'm not seeing any dissent to that, so that's fine. So we'll move on then to agenda item 4, which is a report from BioYorkshire. Sorry, I'm looking in the wrong place.
Thank you very much. I'm Charlie Jeffrey from the University of York. It's a pleasure to be here. I think I had intended to be as an earlier session, but that fell through, so it's good to be with you in the end. We sent a slide deck in, which is as background. I'm not going to talk through all of those slides, but it's in the pack, and I'm happy to address anything that arises from that. What I want to do now is to very briefly set out the key features of BioYorkshire under 5 headings. First heading is that BioYorkshire is first and foremost a partnership. It's a partnership of the University of York with Askham Bryan College and Ferrer Science. And that's a unique alignment of capabilities in the space of the bioeconomy. It enables us to think of an end-to-end capability. And what I mean by that is from discovery science, in which the University of York in this field has been among the most successful institutions in the world for the last 2 decades or so, right through to the technologies emerging from that science which have commercial application. And alongside that, we have an alignment of skills development capability, which can go from across all levels of the skills spectrum, from A-level right through to PhDs. And that really is a unique constellation. There aren't any other places in the UK which have that unique constellation, which we've now crystallized into this partnership. And that underlies the second element of BioYorkshire I wanted to bring out, and that is that it's now an economic development program with 3 core components. The first is net zero food production, farming, and land use. Secondly, the bio-based production of chemicals, materials, and fuels. And then thirdly, connecting the 2 of those, circular economy technologies. So basically, we don't waste anything from agriculture and food production. We repurpose it into things which add value. The heartland technology, if you like, is one described in a slide as the move from crude oil to crude sugar. We don't just use oil for energy, we also use it for chemicals and materials. But essentially, you can use the same kind of processes to get the chemicals, materials, and fuels from crude sugar, from the starches that are produced in current agricultural production, rather than the things that are the result of photosynthesis and things growing many millions of years ago. We've worked very hard to think about how all those capabilities in those areas can be brought together. You can see in one of the slides the impacts we foresee on GVA, on employment, on reduction of CO2 emissions and reduction of landfill, but also the potential for a powerful economic cluster. And indeed, one of the 30 economic clusters around the UK that's been identified by the current Science Minister, George Freeman, who visited the BioYorkshire programme last year with some enthusiasm, I should say. That economic development vision is now supported by the York and North Yorkshire LEP, by the City of York Council and North Yorkshire County Council, and through those has become a small chapter in the devolution deal document. Small but rather interesting, because it commits national and regional authorities to explore opportunities to support the development of BioYorkshire through the mobilisation of both public and private sector funding sources. One commentator called this an example or a prototype for the devolution of R&D policy, which I think is an opportunity we should be keen to take up. The third thing that BioYorkshire is a set of proposals for investment from those public and private sector sources to catalyse and release the potential of that cluster. There are three main proposals for investment. The first is a global bioeconomy institute, which would maintain and grow our capabilities in cutting edge science in these fields and help us to explore their applications. The second is a bioeconomy skills academy, essentially about retooling the workforce, in part a scientific workforce, in part a more general rural economy workforce, to be able to deal with new bioeconomy applications. And then thirdly, a set of business incubation and acceleration activities, including a network of district incubation hubs across the whole of the region, and an acceleration, or broadly speaking, a training programme available to early stage businesses across the region to help them understand how to develop their ideas more fully, win funding for them, scale up, and so on. The fourth thing that BioYorkshire is a programme with very strong private sector support. We have an industry advisory group chaired by Steve Bagshaw, who was the chief exec at Fujifilm Diosynth, but also including key businesses in the food, chemicals, utilities sectors, and others. There's also strong investment interest from a number of directions, from developers who are interested in building business facilities, business parks in which companies in this field could locate or could grow from the incubation stage. Venture funders keen to have a pipeline of early stage companies to invest in and help to secure their scale up, but also longer term underpinning patient capital investment into the broad capabilities of the cluster as a whole. And fifthly and finally, the last thing that BioYorkshire is a programme that aligns very strongly with City of York Council ambitions, both in its economic strategy, in those fields of responsible business, green growth, high skills, growing productivity, which I know are important to the council, but also its climate strategy, resonating very clearly with ambitions in the circular economy, in green innovation, and in renewable resources. With those five features, I'll close, but I'll close by saying that they're now a very serious platform for discussion with the working group that was set up in the devolution deal, which brings together senior officials from different parts of Whitehall and the research councils, but also in those conversations with potential private sector investors. And that's all because we have that unique constellation of assets in the University of York, Askham Bryan College and Ferroscience. Very happy to elaborate on any of that or anything else that was in the slide deck in the papers, or indeed anything else to do with BioYorkshire. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That's very good. Thank you. And there are lots of different questions raised by all of that. I'll first of all put it out to members. What questions would you like to pose on that? Yes, Councillor Myers.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much for the presentation there, Charlie, and for all the work that the University of York have done on this project. From my perspective, really leading the way over a number of years, and you know, I welcome that initiative from the university to look at the local economy and in the region as well as the city, and to drive this as a massive opportunity, as you've explained. We've called it a Green New Deal many times over, and note the number of jobs that could be achieved from this project. 4,000. So a question to you would be, because I'm unclear, I haven't seen a timescale on when this project could reach 4,000 jobs. At what length of time are we looking? Decades or years? And then a second question for you would be about, I think George Freeman mentioned a master plan that's to be drawn up in spring this year. I guess any updates on that master plan would be useful, and maybe how it would differ from what is already in the public domain to further drive the project forward. I have a second part to that, but it'd be interesting to hear what you've got to say on that master plan. Yeah, thanks for that, Chair.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Danny. The outputs or the outcomes which are listed in the presentation are about a 10-year program. So the initial modelling that we did, and it's now about 18 months old, I think, was what we anticipated then that we would get from over 10 years from the investment in BioYorkshire. We are now working on a master plan. That's something that we are doing in the context of the committee, which was the working group that was set up via the devolution deal document. And that's essentially a fleshing out of that earlier economic impact analysis, so that we can put ourselves in the position to effectively write Treasury Green Book business cases for those investments in the Bioeconomy Institute, the Skills Academy, and the network of incubation activities across the region. So that will give us a much fuller understanding of the impacts of different kinds of investment in building that bigger picture over that 10-year period. I rather hope that when we do that work, it will show that there will be even greater impacts than the ones that we found in the analysis around 18 months ago. We've had one meeting of that working group so far, and lots of supplementary discussions. We've commissioned some additional work to help think through the stages of that master plan, and we hope to take a further version or an initial version of the bigger master plan to a meeting which I think we're looking to schedule in April. So we hope to have more to say about this in due course.
Yes, yeah.
And just thank you so much for that. And just the follow up really would be, I know that the combined authority, York and North Yorkshire, would be a member. And, you know, I understand you will have worked with the City of York Council to get to this point. And so I guess, is there anything else that the City of York Council could be doing to further support this work and to help it accelerate as you've described towards those 4,000 jobs? Really, I suspect the answer is they're doing everything, but if there is something, it'd be worth exploring that, of course.
Well, thank you. I mean, the City Council, as North Yorkshire County Council, and as the districts that used to populate North Yorkshire, we're all very supportive in those early stage discussions which led to the drafting of the devolution deal document and its launch. I think now we're in a moment as we build towards the combined authority, we're thinking through what will become possible with the combined authority, and what the City of York Council can do in that context becomes really, really important. Because there are funding streams which are released by the establishment of the authority and the gain share mechanism. And it is quite possible to use some of those mechanisms to fund loans, which could help with some of the capital costs of these investments. And we're really looking to build a package which uses public funding, national and regional, in whichever form and proportions we can bring about, to help leverage the private sector funding that I think will really lift off this programme. So if I would say, what can the council do? It's think through that process of how we will work when we have those additional financial levers at our disposal, because we can use them to put pressure on the national level to make its contribution. And I think that mutual leverage question is one we should all think very hard about.
Yep. Councillor Barnes.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, thank you for the report. It's really fascinating and encouraging. And I should declare an interest, actually, so apologies for not having done so. Day job currently on the register is offshore wind, but actually it's offshore wind innovation. So I work for one of the catapult organisations. So just to be completely transparent, because I think there are some connections in terms of, as you say, some of the science, innovation, technology department and funding sources. So, I mean, first observation, this is clearly very encouraging and good to see. And I'm curious as to how you see the kind of revenue overheads for the partnership working, because I've kind of worked on similar-ish joint ventures under collaboration agreements, and I've seen some of the, I suppose, advantages, disadvantages, and some of the pitfalls. And I just wonder, on the innovation side in particular, obviously, you're going to have separate R&D functions within each of the partner organisations. There will be research staff at the university. What's the mechanism to kind of bring those partners together? And will there be a dedicated sort of R&D function for the partnership funded through central government in all likelihood, science innovation funding?
I think the answer to that question is that it remains to be seen. Danny Myers mentioned George Freeman, who is a very activist science minister and has a particular personal background in related fields. And in conversations with him, he has raised the idea of, as he called them, cluster development corporations. Now, development corporations are normally associated with the repurposing of industrial land, which was used for something else, which is not used for anymore. You can't do that with a cluster, because it's a cluster, it's all over the place. So I think he's setting a vision in mind of how you might understand investment as not simply investment into a university or into an early stage business or into a new business park, obviously those things, but understanding them as part of the cluster as a whole, and envisaging some kind of collaborative investment vehicle. And one of the lines in the devolution deal document points towards that. I forget the exact wording, but it's something along those lines. That's one of the other issues that we're going to be thinking through and taking to this working group that was established by the devolution deal, which currently only has national officials on, but once we move to the mayoral authority, we'll also have regional officials on. I don't know how that will work in practice. I can say that we're talking with one potential funder of that kind of activity and beginning to scope out what a joint vehicle could be. It's early stage, but I think there is a bit of political will, and I think the level of interest from the private sector that we've seen suggests that there's a possibility we can make it happen.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you. And I appreciate it's very hard. You're organically growing something from scratch and it's a unique model. So it's you know, it wouldn't be right to fix structure too firmly before you've run that course. And it's one of those areas where governance really comes into its own. And so governance kind of related question, which is around innovation, and there'll be various output and outcomes targeted there, and KPIs, no doubt, whether that's IP creation, whether it's, you know, turnover on R&D spend or spin out products, new services to market, so on. Just wondered what, if anything, how far you've developed thinking around joint retention and kind of understanding of where the benefit of some of those outputs under joint R&D initiatives will be retained and felt.
I can't give you anything specific, but I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to look at in the context of these discussions, and may well become more concrete once we have the new mayoral institutions, regional level institutions, because I guess only then can we think through fully those questions of governance and how, if, for example, gain share is used in some way to invest in this, that the accountability to the mayoral authority and to the constituent units thereof is maintained. So it's certainly something in our mind, but probably premature to give you an answer on at this point.
I mean, the one risk, obviously, that you will have noted, and that I'd like to flag, is you've got some really big multinational corporates involved here. You know, Anglo is mentioned, for example, and just, I'm sure you will, but would be very keen to see that kind of public interest protected as the scheme develops.
Well, you can imagine, so would I, because we're quite a bit smaller than some of those companies.
Developing on that before we move on to other questions, the points you've made there, Councillor Barnes. In terms of, I sit on the Regions Pension Fund Committee. We're dealing with investments of very considerable sums of money all the time, and the whole thing is informed by a strategy that enables us to evaluate potential investments to comply with the Paris Climate Agreement, etc., zero carbon, all the rest of it. What measures are in place currently to enable the engagement you have with your investors and potential investors to ensure that you're going in the right direction from the word go, which I think is kind of variation on what you're saying as well, isn't it?
Well, the devolution deal as a whole has a language of carbon negative, and it's not going to get there unless things like BioYorkshire work really to transform the way our economy works, and in particular to reduce that dependence on fossil fuels. So I think there is an inherent net zero compliant drive behind all that we do. Again, we haven't got that that far into that discussion of the kind of investment vehicle and the kind of governance structure around it. But I think it would be quite perverse if we didn't have that kind of consideration in mind, given the nature of this programme, which has net zero and a transition to a net zero economy as its centre point. It is a good prompt because, as you will know, it is quite likely that we will see the release of additional funding from the pension sector to be invested in the economy as one of the consequences of Brexit enabling less money to be held back in reserve. And I think it would, at a national level, if we change the regulatory framework, be a very important point that we have a net zero criterion against the additional investment capability. It's certainly something I would want to put in any discussions with some of those long-term patient capital investors we might be working with.
Yeah, that's good to hear, because I can tell you on the Pension Fund Committee, we regularly discuss how the pension, this is for the regional pension fund, how public sector pensions can help to drive infrastructure change regionally, as well as investing in global products. And one of the first questions is, well, how can you guarantee the carbon zero intentions of what you're doing and monitor the scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions? All of that is continuously being rehearsed in public sector pension schemes now. So it would seem an important part of what you do. Again, before I just pass over, I just want to recap on the question that was posed under public participation. There was a question about being radical, not just reflecting the world as it is, but challenging the way things are. And some of the technologies that are referred to in this document are echoes of how we deal with the technologies of today. There was less on shaping the future that we need to reach. So I was just wondering if you wanted to address that, give us a sense of your thinking or the partnership's thinking on
that. At some point, you might wish to have somebody who can talk about the science more fully than I can, because I'm not a scientist by background. But I'll give you an example as a flavour, I think, of that transformative potential. I was in India a couple of weeks ago, working in various ways to build partnerships between the university and institutions in India, universities, businesses, and government. And I was in a conversation with people from from a major Indian corporation which has a major interest in air travel. Now, air travel is a hugely problematic area for net zero transition, because the kind of battery technologies that we can use in other forms of transport and potentially for short haul flights are not going to be viable for long haul flights. So what you need to do there is to think, unless you stop traveling, to think of ways of enabling net zero or something close to net zero aviation fuel. That notion of moving from crude oil to crude sugar gives an opportunity to do that. Now, sugar is used already to produce bioethanol, which is used widely as an alternative for road transport. Wouldn't quite work for jets, but there is the opportunity, if we develop the technologies in the right way and the supply chains in the right way, to use agricultural starches to produce jet fuel. And that conversation I had with the big Indian company with a big interest in the airline sector was one that they latched onto immediately as something of huge potential. Now, I'll give you that example as a kind of roundabout response to your question about how we can think transformatively.
Right, yeah, okay. Are there other questions from here? I'll just develop that point one little bit further, if I may. There's in your report information about creating plastics. In my background includes product design. There are lots of things that are described as compostable, biodegradable, etc., that technically you can say that, but actually the practical reality is there'll only be 2 places in the world that can actually do it. And the idea that you're gaining a benefit by switching from fossil fuel as your source material for a plastic, when we're talking about this big picture stuff and BioYorkshire, can be called into question by many people as to whether you're actually contributing a solution or simply finding a different way of doing the same thing, which I think reflects back to what the public speaker said. Is there a sense in which the potential partnerships we're seeing are going to be able to go beyond that and do other things? And what can the local authority and others do to help encourage such a thing?
And there's a really important point there, because you can produce plastics from starches, and they can be just as non-biodegradable as plastics produced through the refinements of fossil fuels. You can do it in a better way, so that they are biodegradable, or you can combine it with other technologies, bacterial digestion and others, which can address the problem in a different way if you design it in at the outset. And I think that's the point, to design either full biodegradability or a capacity to use other techniques to prevent harm in the way that we have, through fossil fuels, for a long time unwittingly and now quite wittingly produced harm.
Yeah. Are there any other comments people would like to make at this stage? I'm not seeing any, so well, thank you very. Oh, Councillor Colwick, yes.
Just before we move on completely, you made the point early on that the particular constellation of partners is somewhat unique. But I would be interested to know whether there are similar initiatives you're aware of in other places. How far are we, as it were, in competition with other initiatives? And how far are we already collaborating with our other initiatives, be that within the UK or internationally?
Within the UK, there's only one other place which has a similar set of capabilities, and that's in and around Norwich, or Cambridge to Norwich corridor, where you have brilliant science and a translational capability into economic application. Do we collaborate? Yeah, absolutely. The lead academic in BioYorkshire, Ian Graham, an absolutely brilliant scientist, is also one of those scientists, and not all of them are like this, who is essentially collaborative and is somebody who's set up to national and international networks broadly in the bioeconomy field. And if you've got two locations like that in one country, the links between them, if you have those networks, going to be especially dense. We also have relationships elsewhere. We have a partnership with the University of Maastricht in the Netherlands, which, from a slightly different direction, which is probably rather more based in chemistry, as Councillor Wan will will have an interest than biology, but is focusing in that same space of thinking differently about how we can use the products of agriculture and food production in a different way. In India, I was exploring the potential for partnerships and given the opportunity not simply to think about our own economic development and our own transition to net zero, but to export the capabilities and hasten others' transition to net zero. I was really excited to find a receptivity, for example, in that major industrial concern I talked about earlier. But also one of the universities we visited, and India is an extraordinarily dynamic place, and universities have popped up in all sorts of ways in the public and private sector in recent years. But we had a very interesting encounter with a university whose initial benefactors made their money from sugarcane. And if you're talking about the transition from crude oil to crude sugar, it's not unhelpful to know people like that. And the university concerned has a very strong agri-tech capability, part of which has emerged from that company, and thinking about how you can use sugarcane not just to produce refined sugar, but all the other things that you can get from the different parts of the plant, or the other ways in which you can use the primary products of the plant. So I think we have opportunities to be part of a global network in which we can both export some of our capabilities, but also learn from elsewhere and import some of theirs. Ultimately, I think we're talking here about climate change. It's not something that respects national boundaries. So the more that we can nurture collaboration, both scientifically, but also in the application of science that helps us towards net zero, the better.
Thank you. It just provokes the last idea for me to ask you if you're working with planning and planners in York. And I asked that because you've just mentioned the Netherlands. And if I'm correct, the Netherlands, in spite of being tiny, is the second biggest food exporter in the world, I believe. And I'm keen to get a sense of whether you think there's a part, maybe you're already doing this, but whether there's a part to play for the local authority in enabling the development and consideration of things like vertical farming in urban areas, of changing planning regulations to require major developments to be growing food, whether this is something that's already happening in York, or whether it's something you think going forward could be happening between the City Council and BioYorkshire.
Well, I think the City Council has developed a broad 10-year plan which incorporates a number of strategies, including sustainability and economy, which clearly push in that direction. I think there is every opportunity to think hard about that in the planning process and in planning priorities. There is a real opportunity for this place, York and its surrounds, to become a catalyst on a scale which is much bigger than this place. But that requires us to think about developments in this place in order to enable that to happen. And so I'd be very happy to have further conversations about this with the planners on the City Council.
Thank you. Councillor Baker.
Thanks, Chair. It's just a supplementary, maybe to ask Sean about the supplementary planning document relating to climate change, whether that's been written or where we are with that.
Yes, Sean.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. The climate change sustainability supplementary planning document is in production at the moment. I think we're expecting our first draft end of April.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions, so thank you very much. It's been very interesting and informative. I hope we'll hear more in the future.
Been a pleasure, thanks.
Right, we are now moving on to agenda item 8, which is on page 113 for members. LED lighting update, solar lighting.
Thank you, Chair. So I think everyone knows me, but for the millions watching, I'm James Gilchrist, the Director for Environment, Transport and Planning. So I'll give you a brief introduction and then introduce some of my colleagues to talk to you. So the council's converted about 50% of its 22,000-ish columns to LED, and that's part of our drive to reduce electricity usage, which obviously has benefits in terms of carbon, but also had the potential to reduce electricity bills. And we previously talked here about the sort of indirect link between electricity usage and electricity bills for street lighting. Derek Grant, who is our street lighting manager, is working with Sean on bids for funding to accelerate that transition to LED. I think just in terms of the current policy is that we will use solar where it's appropriate, so keep left, no entry signs, those sorts of things. And we have used solar for non-street lighting solutions such as Holroyd Park and at some rural bus stops. Solar technology is progressing all the time, and the policy says we'll keep it under review. So as part of the report to this committee, we've commissioned WSP to do a study of the technology, where it is at today and whether it could meet our current street lighting policy. So we're joined by Alan Howard from WSP, and I'm going to hand over to him just to give you a sort of brief summary of what his study document that's in the papers attached sort of tells us.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Good afternoon, Chair. Good evening.
Good afternoon.
So my name's Alan Howard. I'm Group Technical Director for Lighting and Energy Solutions at WSP. I've been doing lighting for 40 years now, and I'm involved in developing a lot of technical guidance for the UK. As advised, we've been commissioned by the City of York to look into solar energy. We are in an energy crisis at the moment. We are seeing the energy rates escalate massively. Last week it was mentioned that even potentially hitting 70p a kilowatt hour. And obviously we're looking at net zero requirements as well. So it's right and proper to look at any alternatives that we can to help reduce the electrical consumption of the public lighting. As a local authority, you have a power to light, you don't have a duty to light, but where you exercise the power, it has to be made sure that we do look to light correctly, and that generally means that we need to act responsibly and follow the standards and the guidance that exists. As advised, the City of York are already looking at an LED upgrade, but you're also looking at how the lighting is applied, and adaptive lighting is being applied where the lighting levels are adjusted throughout the night to help reduce the energy load as well, which is a great aspect. So what we've done is we've done a review of the alternative power technologies at the moment, whether that's solar, whether that's wind and other variants of those technologies, or how they can be combined together to provide the street lighting provision. Now, from the details of the report, it is possible that we think if you go and look at just pure footpaths, it is feasible to consider some aspects of solar lighting that will keep the lights going all night. But if we want to go and look at other applications like residential roads, it's very difficult at this time. Essentially, if we look at this time of year, it's dark for 16 hours and we get 8 hours of charge. That's not enough time to actually boost the batteries sufficiently to be able to run the wattage of lighting that we're looking at to provide the lighting for, say, a residential road all night. And we can do some adaptive lighting. We'll reduce the lighting level, say, after 10 o'clock at night or something, but that still doesn't give us enough time at this time of year to do that. But what it also doesn't do is it doesn't give us the reliability that we should be able to do 2 cycles without enough solar gain into the batteries as well. So again, we don't comply on that. Battery technology is improving all the time. At the moment, we reckon we'd have to replace the batteries every 6 years. So that's a cost and consideration. And at this time of year, as I find with my hybrid electric car, my batteries do not accept the same amount of charge as they do in the summer because it's just so cold. So we have that consideration as well. So from what we're looking at the moment is that solar standalone is not an option to provide functional lighting all year to meet the required service. We can look at hybrid technologies. There are some companies that will do solar and small wind turbines. They're not greatly aesthetically pleasing. They do make a little bit of noise, and therefore that might not be suitable in a lot of environments. But perhaps in a park or where we're seeing them successfully used, they could be put somewhere where there's not many residents around or something. But even then, we can't guarantee that the lighting will be provided all night. But what we have just seen, and it's only recently come onto the market, there is a company that is now looking at Solaris lighting, where they can now look at solar technologies of the wraparound type on suitable columns that is linked to the mains. So what we can do is we can charge up the batteries during the daytime with what solar powers that is available, and then we can run those batteries when it gets dark. And then when the battery gets to a certain low level, we can switch over to the mains electricity supply and make sure we provide the right level of lighting that's required. The reason this is important is that when we pay for public lighting, I'm sorry if I'm teaching you what you already know, but I thought it's just important, is that it's not a flat rate of energy. The flat rate of energy that we pay is calculated based on the profile. And at this time of year, electricity at this time of day is hellishly expensive. You know, you're looking at pounds per kilowatt hour, but in the middle of the night, it's very cheap. So basically your profile is put in and you average out and you come up with the pence per kilowatt hour. If we can use the batteries now for say 4 or 5 hours at this time of year, we're covering the really expensive time where electricity is available. And we've seen that by the fact that as residents and everything, we've been asked, can we cut our electricity use in these hours and we'll give you some money back? And that will help reduce the profile and help minimize the amount of pence per kilowatt hour that you're actually charged. Meantime, we are being green at the certain time, but we are making sure that the lighting service is actually provided. I think that's roughly that in the nutshell.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. And I think that what the report talks about is looking at a small scale trial of this sort of technology on a residential street where we can test it. We'd need to obviously consult heavily with residents if we're doing that, because you know they might see differences in light levels, etc. So that's in a summary where we're at. I don't know if you want to particularly add, Derek.
No, I think like I say, that report's coming into it, and I think it identifies what the options are, certainly in residential streets, which was raised as an option for solar on our adopted highway. But no, I think the report identifies a lot of what is possible, and including what Alan said about hybrid version. So yeah, no, nothing to add over and above that.
So happy to take any questions from the committee.
Yep. Questions? Yes, Councillor Baker.
Thanks, Chair. I've got a couple of little questions, mainly to do with consulting with residents, really, as to what's best for them. So with the financial saving, first I'll ask about the residential areas. Replacing the columns, can you confirm whether they have to go from a 5 metre up to a 6 metre? Because I think that's what some of residents would be concerned about, with the height of the lights then in line with their bedrooms.
I'll pass over to Des and the technical people to talk about it. But yes, generally we move columns up, but the LED lighting is also a lot more directional in terms of its light spill. So actually you get less light pollution from the modern lighting. I don't know whether I'll pass over to the experts.
I'll answer briefly, then I'll go into some detail, but from a York perspective, yes, that's what we try to achieve is best uniformity we can get on current positions on the level that we dictate in our policy, or the categories the categories we dictate, we illuminate to in our policy, and 6 metre, to be honest, is the best way of achieving that in most residential areas of York. Possibly not all, but most as a generic.
Sorry, can I just clarify? So they will need to be 6 metres, but what can you do to reassure residents that it won't harm their well-being?
Well, and every lighting scheme and every LED conversion, I mean, the manufacturers' lanterns that we're using, the technology now is very controlled. So we try to keep the lighting footprint on the highway. That's what we're trying to achieve every time we light with LED. Again, difficult in some areas of York because there's a lot of differences in residential areas, terrace streets, there's verges, and then big wide footpaths. There's narrow footpaths, no verges, so it is difficult to achieve it generically, but we do try. Okay.
Councillor Myers.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It follows on from that question, and I know it's not the crux of the report. I do thank you for the report and outlining what options there are for the rest of the council's conversion. But I just want to follow up on this point, because as a ward councillor, we've got lots of complaints about some of the streets being really bright, and you know, and I get that, especially when now they're on higher columns and they're shining into bedrooms. So I've had a couple of very recent queries about, you know, what is the effect of this excess light on people's sleeping habits and well-being, and what is the impact on the wildlife in the area, and if the council's got anything it's going to do to try and shield the lighting in some way. Because I know you mentioned that we have got better scope with directional lighting, so it can be aimed at the highway and pavements, and I totally get that. And in most cases, the lighting's really good. You know, that's what we want to see. The streets, so that people know where they're going. I totally get that. But I am coming up against this query at the moment about, you know, there's a lot of light coming into bedrooms, and are we trying to mitigate where it is being identified as a problem?
I mean, our lighting design should seek to eliminate that. If there are problems, they can be fed through and we can review those. There are shields and things that we've put up in the past to solve those sorts of problems.
Yeah, if I may. The way we've been pressured within the lighting industry by government is that we only have LED light sources now. And we're being pushed on and on for more efficient light sources and LEDs. That had pushed the industry towards what we'd call a cool white light, a very white light. Now that has a very high blue light content, and that is adverse for fauna and flora, bats, insects, etc. And to a certain extent can affect the human circadian rhythm, etc. But we've had lots of advantages now in the warm color temperatures around the 3000 Kelvin, which I think is the specification that, or the approach that's looked at now. So we don't use these really high white ones. And we have got larger increases in optical control and little shields that can now fit around each individual LED to help direct it to exactly where we want. Now, there is a lot of publicity around LEDs and white light, but actually people are exposed to much higher levels of lighting in their houses. A lot of them have got white light LEDs, light bulbs and cool white ones, and you're in a closer proximity to them and the lighting levels are much higher. So I think Public Health England have done some investigations to this, and they're more concerned about the internal environment on people as opposed to the outside. That's not to say the outside is not going to have an effect. And there is a certain extent that LED lighting units are not a linear light source anymore. It's lots of little points. So again, these are different things that we've unfortunately got to get used to because we haven't got any other light sources. We can't use lamps anymore. Fluorescent tubes are going to be banned come August, you know, and a lot of our other light sources have gone. So the industry is looking at the best way that we can make sure we use what we've got to the best extent. But as I said, with good design and the right choice of products, we can keep the light where it's needed and not where it's unnecessary.
I have what I hope will be a useful thought to add. In 2008, we did a street lighting strategy report here at the City Council. And as part of that, we reduced power to the bulbs in 2 places, in the car park and in the street near the main library, the name of which momentarily escapes me. We reduced energy to the bulb by between 10 and 30% to see if people could see it, if it perceived it, if it was going to be a hazard, because everyone immediately thinks we'll all be falling into the road and suffering problems and death. The truth of it was nobody noticed the difference. And given the challenge that we face, given what we've heard from you earlier, Alan, about the capacity for batteries to hold charge and so on and so forth, we know that LED lights now, modern ballasts, can vary the energy to the bulb. We know that in countries like Oslo, they'll reduce the energy to the bulb by 40% when it snows, because reflected light off the ground compensates for it. So where residents are worried about the brightness of light at night, why can't we use the technology to simply reduce the power to the LED after, say, 11 o'clock, so that there is less light in the street? That would have the benefit of reducing the annoyance to residents, and in the long run, when we start having metered bills, reducing our bills. And in the case of solar lights, would provide us with one of the methods that we could use to say, well, we have the bright light between 7 and 11 o'clock, or 10 o'clock, and then we just ramp it down. So just wanting to get a sense of how all of that might help to solve several of these problems.
Yeah, there's 2 aspects here. With the advent of white light, we know from how people see that if you stand on the corner of 2 streets, you look at one that was lit with the old high pressure sodium, the orange light, and you look down one that's lit with white light. If they're lit to the same level, you will say the white light's brighter. The British standards that are currently in place have taken that into account. So they have reduced the lighting levels that we have to design to based on white light and how we as humans perceive the lighting level in the street. So that side's been taken into account within the design factors that we don't quite design to the same levels we used to design to with LEDs. From the point of view of the other point that you're talking about, you're already doing it. You're already doing adaptive lighting as part of your strategy, and you're already reducing the lighting levels in the streets after certain times, which is compliant with the standards because we light based on the level of task. So if there's less people walking, we can have a lower level. If there's less cars on the road, we can reduce it. We tend not to say to the residents, we're going to dim your lighting because they don't like it. We say we're going to adapt your lighting to the task, and they like that. And of course, there is also the ultimate that you, like some authorities, you could go to part night where you turn off, but you wouldn't necessarily want that in the city.
Yeah, so the technology is there. We can use it. We are in certain places using it, or we're using it everywhere. I wasn't quite clear.
I'd have to.
Yeah, on the generic approach, like I say, for point on maintenance, LED swap outs, which is the way we're approaching it at the moment. All 4 of our packages are dimmed post midnight. 60% on the residential scenarios and 70% on a couple of the service road sort of target lanterns that we use on 8-metre columns on service roads or residential bus routes, stuff like that. But they are reduced to 70% or 60% in the residential, yeah.
Okay.
Some 50%, yeah.
That's good to hear. Thank you. Yes, Councillor Collingwood.
Thank you. This is a climate scrutiny, not a planning committee, but I will nevertheless ask the question I'm going to ask. And that is, how far do considerations around such things as conservation come into play? I think, for example, of the lighting recently installed along New Walk, which many residents feel is not appropriate in a conservation area. When we look at areas around the city centre, which can be quite sensitive, I wonder whether the technology might be acceptable, but the fixtures themselves are maybe not sensitive to location. The other point I would make is that because it is so much more directional and there's far less spillage, it also quite unintentionally leaves other areas that were well lit and needed to be in utter darkness. So, for example, and I'm using New Walk as an example, the stairwell access points that benefited from the spillage of light previously are now utterly in the dark, and therefore there's a safety issue. And so what may be a benefit in one situation is not a benefit in another. I'm wondering how far that's taken into account, but this is not a planning committee or a ward meeting. It is climate scrutiny. But I just thought I'd raise those questions, even if you're not able to answer them immediately.
I think just very quickly, just to sort of address them. So we do take conservation area as into account. So quite a profile case where we replaced the lamp column up by the Minster that was knocked over by a vehicle last year at great expense. So that was one where we absolutely took conservation into account. I think there probably is lessons for us to learn about the New Walk project, and I think we'll take that away as something that we can look at and improve on how we engage with the conservation team. So I think that's just a piece of learning for us about how we can potentially do things better in the future.
Thank you. The point of maybe not the right way of putting it, but the point of this report is at the end, you're saying we want to conduct a trial.
Well, I think what we're saying is we'll do the design work on a trial. We will need to engage with residents, which I think Councillor Baker was sort of making that point, that that's really important where we are making a change. So we'll engage with residents on that, and then that will go through to the exec member to consider whether they want to implement that as a trial piece of technology or not.
Yeah. So, well, I had a comment to make on that, and maybe others also have. So you explained, Alan, at the start that you didn't think that solar LED lighting is yet at a point where it can be used to replace our grid powered lighting. Going forwards, I'm in one of those wards that has a solar LED street light at a bus stop. It took a long time before thinking it was a good idea to spend ward committee funding on it, because I've seen previous iterations that were frankly just like candles on a birthday cake. When this was finally installed, actually residents were very impressed, and it's performed very well. It's a lighting column that has a wraparound LED. And one of the things that influenced it, the key driver, was the cost, because it's a rural area and actually getting the mains to the bus stop. We were talking about £20,000 to get a street light, whereas the solar light column was £6,000. And that's a serious consideration for any city. When you say we don't yet have the technology to be able to power a light through the night, one of the things that comes to my mind then is, on the one hand, there's £20,000 for getting a grid connection. There's £6,000 for a lighting column. Why can't we just have 2 columns and 1 light? So we've got 2 lots of LED power and 1 light to light. That still comes to £12,000, which is a third, 2/3 of the price of the other way of doing it. And the reason I advance that is because in terms of doing a trial, there are lots of streets in rural areas that currently have no lighting. And I imagine there are also in urban areas where the cost of putting in the grid connection is prohibitive. And going forwards, I think it's important to look at that. And I would be happy for the trial to be both an urban street and a rural street, to make sure that we get a balanced view. And then from that, a broader strategic point. The going forwards with the grid, we're going to be placing more and more demand on the grid. Electric vehicles and all the rest of it it becomes increasingly useful, don't you think, to actually have technologies that can help parts of the city be free of that dependence on the grid, particularly when you're talking about things like street lighting, so that if we have a power cut, we still got street lights. Going forwards, it seems to me that that kind of a process, one where we're no longer getting electricity bills for street lighting, there are lots of potential advantages of moving forwards constructively to change the pattern of how we power our street lighting. So just keen to have your thoughts on this idea of whether you could have 2 columns and 1 light, whether that's something that we could be looking at to make that step while we wait for technology to catch up.
I mean, essentially, we're looking at technology that's in its infancy, and it is coming on leaps and bounds as the solar panel, whether it's flat or the wrap mount is developed, etc. I mean, what you're basically talking about is you're talking about having an increased area of solar panel and more batteries. There's ways and means of doing that, whether that's, but unfortunately, some of them become quite ugly or clutter in the street. We can put a big solar panel on top of a column, and there's plenty of manufacturers around that are pushing this technology, etc. But they are unsightly and they are heavy structures, etc. But things are moving on. LEDs are getting more efficient, but from the point of view of the bus stop, it needs a certain amount of light, but it's not sort of the same level of lighting we're looking at for making sure we're lighting a road safely, so you've got the uniformity and the right lighting levels, etc. And that's the challenge we've got at the moment. But LED technology is still improving. It's not going as fast as it was. So hopefully, as the wattage that we have to use decreases and the battery technology, because it's essentially a lot of it's in the battery technology, that improves on the solar things, the two will slowly start to come together so that we can then start to look at it. But at the moment, I think if you just wanted to go for just the solar side, where it is put in on zero, the residents would have to accept that come a certain point, it will just turn off because the battery's gone flat. And there's nothing we can do, but the chances are it won't charge up as much the next day to cover the time. And therefore that comes at a risk to the service that's being provided for the users of those streets.
Yeah, thank you. Well, to inform the rest of our members, the light we've got at a bus stop has been working. It was installed last March. It's worked right through the winter. It's not as bright at 2 in the morning, but then there aren't as many people around at 2 in the morning. It's actually doing a very good job between 5 and 9 o'clock when people are coming home on the bus. Yes.
I think just to say we're doing a bit of a review of the Hull Road Park scheme to actually look at the performance of that and how that would work in a street setting, as well as a piece of, an example where we've got in the city and how that would operate in a street setting. So we're doing that as a piece of work that we'll also present to the exec member when we bring forward any thoughts on a trial.
Do you think, James, that a trial in 2 locations might be a useful thing to actually look at those 2 subjects?
Potentially, what I would say is that every location is going to be different. So if you're not careful, you'll end up with a million, well, 22,000 trials. I'm just thinking of the tensions we have in the city when we put new street lights in and they're in the canopies of trees. They're not going to work as solar lighting locations. So there are a whole raft of knock-on effects. Each location needs to be looked at on a case-by-case basis about how it works and whether it's appropriate. So I think at this stage, it's naive to say a one-size-fits-all solution or 2 sizes fits all is going to prove anything, because I think each scheme will need the products that are available and work to be considered in that location, rather than saying we've got a product, we're going to roll it out across the city. I just don't think that'll work.
Yeah, okay. I can think of lots of streets where people have no lighting and they just go, wow, that's fantastic, some lighting, rather than being anxious about how much lighting. But okay, are there any more points people want to make? Okay, fine, thank you very much. We now flick backwards then to agenda item 5, tree canopy target update. That's pages 27. And I think it's you, Sean, isn't it? Yes.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So this report provides an update on progress towards York's tree canopy expansion target, which was established in May 2021 when the executive member for environment and climate change agreed to a target of increasing York's tree canopy cover from 10.8% in 2019 to 13% by 2050. And this target supports the wider regional ambition of the White Rose Forest to increase tree planting across Yorkshire and the north of England. Specific activity that supported achieving this target over the last 2 years has taken the form of 3 strands, really. So firstly, the York Tree Giveaway, the York Community Woodland, and the York Green Streets project. Taking those in turn, in March 2022, so March last year, my team coordinated a very popular tree giveaway event that saw residents of York receive 500 free trees supplied by the Woodland Trust. There was a huge uptake, a huge number of residents registering for those free trees, which just demonstrates a level of demand across the city, I think, for tree planting and how popular tree planting is. The Woodland project started in around March 2020 when we completed land character, heritage, ecology, soil and transport assessments of the sites that we acquired close to Knapton and Rufford villages. A community-focused co-design process has really underpinned the entire approach to the woodland. And this started with a social media campaign called Woodland Memories, where we had people providing information to us on what they felt was important, what they'd like to see from a new woodland in the city. And this subsequently led to consultation on the design of the woodland, which incorporated 800 individual views on that. And that co-design process has really continued throughout the development of the woodland, with residents being involved in tree planting events, wildflower seeding events, and guided woodland walks and talks. We have over 600 individuals signed up to our Keep Informed list, where events and planting opportunities are publicised, and that's now managed by Forestry England. The woodland was celebrated last year as part of the Queen's Green Canopy event, where we planted 70 specimen trees, and that was supplemented by York becoming a Queen's Green Canopy champion city for last year. To support the effective delivery and provide long-term management of the woodland site, the council's partnered with Forestry England, and we're actually the first local authority in the country to partner with Forestry England through their woodland partnership offer. Under that offer, Forestry England are fully funding the capital cost of woodland creation. They're establishing the woodland over the medium term and taking responsibility for managing the site over the next 120 years. The arrangement is subject to a formal lease agreement, and it will be generating revenue for the council over the entirety of that agreement, and the template lease has been provided as an appendix. Also in the appendix is the plastic policy, and that's another one of the benefits of having Forestry England on board, that they bring the expertise that's really allowed us to minimise plastic use across the site. Where possible, and where we're looking at large-scale planting, we've used fencing to prevent animals entering the site and destroying the newly planted trees. Where that's not been possible and tree guards have been required, We've not used plastic tree guards. Actually relates a little bit to the conversation we were having earlier, using biopolymer tree guards where they are required. And again, Forestry England bringing their expertise in that area. The 50,000th tree was planted very recently on the 17th of February by the Lord Mayor. He was joined by local school children, residents and the executive member. We're now up to 83,000 trees planted on site, delivering on the council's commitment to plant 50,000 trees by March 2023. Plantings now come to an end for this planting season, but it will eventually increase to 210,000 trees, one for every resident of York. We've brought in considerable external funding to deliver the woodland and minimise calls on the council's budget. Forestry England, as mentioned, are fronting up the delivery costs. That's estimated at £1.3 million. And we've also accessed funding through the likes of White Rose Forest and the Forestry Commission to provide additional capacity and resourcing to the delivery team. As we hand over day-to-day management of the site to Forestry England now, attention shifts to the development of the site infrastructure, the footpaths and tracks and trails on site, and they'll be developed over the summer. And we're expecting a soft launch to the public next year in 2024. York Green Streets was commenced in March last year as well. We access White Rose Forest funding to undertake opportunity mapping across the city for where trees could be located. In total, 87 sites were assessed. 64 of those were deemed suitable for tree planting, and over 4,000 individual tree planting opportunities were identified. We use that work as an evidence base for a Forestry Commission Woodland Creation Accelerator Fund application, which was successful, and that will provide funding for internal officer capacity to help deliver those 4,000 tree planting opportunities. We're currently in the process of recruiting to those posts, and the next phase of that project will launch on the 1st of April this year. All of this recent activity is within the wider context of the 35,000 trees that the council is responsible for maintaining. And they're estimated to have an asset value of around £79 million to the city. The ongoing planting from our public realm team to replace trees that are lost each year, and also the third-party planting from organisations such as the Environment Agency, Tremendous, and others that are participating in tree planting across the city. We don't currently have a mechanism for tracking numbers of trees planted by external organisations or indeed by private residents, but we did undertake satellite imagery work to calculate York's tree canopy cover in 2019, and replicating that process will be how we monitor progress against that tree canopy expansion target. White Rose Forest plan comes to an end in 2025, when we're expecting a review and an update on those satellite imagery work.
Thank you very much. And on the simplest level, this is a very good news story that we have actually made a difference. We are making a difference, and I certainly want to pass on thanks to all of those involved. The key question surely for all of us is, where do we go from here? What comes next? How do we go further? And one of the things that leaps out from this to me, before I open it out, is in paragraph 22, and you've just mentioned it. We don't have a mechanism to capture the wider contribution private citizens make, and there's plainly a risk there that trees can be going as quickly as we're putting them in, and we just don't know. And so I'd really certainly like to hear what other members think about the need for a tree strategy going forwards. To, for example, say in planning terms, if someone applies to have a tree taken out, it comes with the condition that a tree must be planted. so that we can know that things are not going to get worse. We've got a watermark that we can move up from. And I imagine there are lots of other things a tree strategy could be doing to help us going forwards. But having said that, throw it open, what others have got to say. Yes, Councillor Baker.
Thanks, Chair. So it's just an idea really about that for the tracking mechanism and for public engagement and enthusiasm. I've just checked, and this Better Points app that I signed up to is mainly related to travel. So I wondered whether we could look into, I think we used to, through the council's One Planet York network, also have some kind of app. I'm not sure if it's still running, but could we revive that or look whether there's any national equivalents to an app that we could promote? I think, you know, the Better Points was advertised in our climate emergency newsletter that goes out to all the residents that signed up to it. So if we could find one that was related to ecology and tree planting, that would be a start.
Yes, Councillor Myers. Oh, sorry,
Thank you, Chair. Couple of points, and then I'll pick you up actually on the tree strategy that you just mentioned. Thanks for the report and update. The White Rose Forest is a big success, and I'm really pleased about that personally, because I banged on about it for a long time before, frankly, it was taken serious by the council. I did bring White Rose into this building to meet with Director of Place and Chief Planner, and I think we got snubbed for at least 18 months before the council signed up. So to see the success in this report of that project is a really good moment, and I hope we can build on it. And moving on from that, as a ward councillor, we took part in the Green Streets, and I noted the executive members list that went round, and I just wondered how happy we were with the scale of that, because we put forward suggestions, and I think we got 12 trees, and out of 1,000 we could put forward more suggestions, but we actually thought that we could get more than 12 trees on the suggestions we put forward. And I know other wards got very similar amounts, and then other wards got a massive amount to kind of make up the numbers, in a sense, is how I read it. So can we just be more ambitious on that? I know that there can be more than 12 trees planted on Roundtree Avenue, which is one of our key sites. So I guess a bit of background on how that came about and whether we can just improve it would be really useful. And then lastly, sorry, let's keep going. The tree strategy. I think I totally agree. The amount of times I've actually had to fight the council to put a tree back on public land because they say we can't put one back in there, is ridiculous. So both on public land for public tree loss, that would be a start. Private tree loss that's just not monitored is ridiculous to me. So a planning-led approach to say that can't happen, this is the policy for replacement, would be brilliant. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Yes, Sean.
Thanks, Councillor Myers. Yeah, I'm really glad you picked up on the relationship with the White Rose Forest. I think we're now in a really good place with our relationship with White Rose Forest. And it was that relationship actually that led to the award of funding to undertake the first phase of the Green Streets opportunity mapping. That funding was relatively modest, and we were constrained by capacity and time and the level of funding. But you're right, I'm sure there are more tree planting opportunities out there. We've not covered all of them, and we would be really keen to duplicate and replicate the work that we've done in phase one to identify more tree planting opportunities across the city. I think the priority and the challenge we have right now is how we deliver on those 4,000 that we've identified at the moment, but we would like to do more mapping and to continue to build that pipeline of tree planting opportunities across the city. That approach that we took in phase one of Green Streets is actually White Rose Forest are looking to replicate that in other areas, and they've got a proposal in with the West Yorkshire Combined Authority to do that over on their patch. So we really were leading the way with that one. I don't think we've exhausted all the potential sites by any means. On the tree strategy, I suppose there is a potential opportunity to incorporate some of what's been discussed in one of the supplementary planning documents that's being produced to support the local plan. Maybe the biodiversity supplementary planning document would be the most suitable place for that one. But then there's other things associated with tree planting and tree maintenance that might be better fitting in a tree strategy, but there's people better qualified than me at the council to talk on that.
Did you want to come in, Dave? Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Dave Mee from Public Realm. I just want to come back on some of Councillor Myers' comments, just by explanation. The project, as Sean said, was incredibly time limited. We had 3 months to get consultants and get the report done. So they were hit with whatever streets we could give them. And undoubtedly, that was only a small fraction of the city streets where we have potential. The reasons for bringing them in was that there isn't the resource in-house to really research every street. And they were charged with, like, the streets we gave them to walk the streets. We gave them maps, and then they came back to us and we sought utility surveys. And that is the key to tree planting in the urban area, knowing where your utilities are. They're underground often, they're hidden, and that is your problem. The public and yourselves see a space and think you can put a tree there. I'm afraid quite often we can't. And even more strangely, sometimes there's a tree there in the past, because since then, the gas, the water, electric, and most recently, the phone network, the cable network has really taken up a lot of space on Verges. So we're more than happy to double check what was suggested for Roundtree and any particular street, but my gut is it was because there are things you can't see. And that's one of the difficulties we have persuading executive members why we can't, and members of the public, particularly when a tree has got Verge has got trees in, and why can't you put more in? Because possibly in the first place you shouldn't have been planted anyway, numerous streets. But it's things you can't see are the problem.
So going forward, and I'll then pass over to Councillor Myers. For me, that's part of what a strategy is all about, because I've had a similar experience to Councillor Myers in Weldrake Ward. The Environment Agency came down, they said, yes, we'll plant you 100 trees. And that was, let's be fair, it was towards the tail end of COVID when there was a small window to walk down and look at it. 18 months later, the trees aren't there because of a series of bureaucratic hurdles that have been difficult for all involved. And for me, and I take on board what you've just said, Dave, about changing regulations as well as utilities. So one of the things that popped up was you can't plant a tree if the crown of the mature tree is closer than 7 meters to the highway. To which my response was, does that mean that 98% of all the trees and hedges in the rural areas are all going to have to be dug up? And of course, it doesn't mean that. It's changing regulation. But the complexity and the confusion that trails on from that actually mitigates against us doing what we all want to do. And my hope would be that a strategy would set out like a recipe book so that individuals, partners, conservation groups, etc., could tick off their list. What do I need to do to get trees down this street or down? Who do I need to refer to? Do I need to get a CAT scan? Do I need to look at the utilities map? All of that, so that it would be, the strategy would be designed around the idea that if you can answer all these questions, you can go ahead and plant your trees, not what's the next obstacle? What's the next obstacle that we all then have to fight over and feel depressed by? So I'm going to hand over to Councillor Myers, but I'm going to offer at the end of this that I think it would be good if we had a recommendation that we progressed a tree strategy. Councillor Myers.
Yeah, I'd second that. Let's do that rather than get depressed. I just wanted a quick question of you, Dave, about, you know, I get all that with the utilities maps and I've been through them as well. Can we plant anything in these verges? Is there an option at all? Maybe not what we usually put in verges that are free of utilities, but you know, is there something that we could do to improve the environment on those streets where we want to introduce more planting that's maybe lower lying or something? Are there any options, basically?
Yes. It's basically how much we want to spend. Like, you know, I've been trite about it, but if in the city centre at top of Fossgate, you know, trees, if you create a box or, you know, a special box that tree sits in, it stops the roots from growing out into utilities. So there are engineered solutions, but they come at a price. What I'd like to add is the good news about the Green Streets project. Sean alluded to, I've been interviewing today, and we will soon be able to announce, I hope, some new appointments to deliver the scheme. And that those officers will be charged basically with knocking on your door and saying, right, we want to now progress Roundtree Avenue. Let's go and have a look. And it may throw up new opportunities. There may have been, in those 12, there may have been another 5 that are grey that need further investigation. I don't know the detail of the document, but I'm getting very close to be able to start saying, we want to put a tree in here.
Yes, James, and then Councillor Conway.
I was just going to say the council does have a tree policy. It's reviewed by Scrutiny. I think some of you have even sat on it from memory, and reviewed it certainly within the last 3-4 years from memory. And it does make it's not as quite as overt as a commitment to replace every tree with a like-for-like replacement, but it does talk about that as being an aim of the policy. So I think it's more about reviewing the policy than it is about we need one, because there is one.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Conway.
I'm pleased that you've said that, because the point I was going to make is I thought we had one. Certainly as chair of planning, I come across it from time to time. And I'm encouraged when I think invariably when planning applications come before planning committee, we look consistently and carefully at tree planting. And in the majority of instances, the application will result in more trees rather than fewer. I'd also like to say I'm not depressed. I think we've achieved an incredible amount, and congratulations for that. And not just the City of York Council, but all these other partners and agents and charities across the city, making a very considerable difference. And where those 500 trees went almost straight away, didn't they? Is that not something that can be repeated? Is not something that we could do every year, or?
Well, subject to availability of the trees
Sure.
from the Woodland Trust and the capacity of the officers to do that, because yeah, they went in less than an hour, I think, the sign-ups, but there's still capacity required to make that happen, and to physically give out those trees, but subject to those requirements, it's something that could be replicated.
So if we, in light of what we heard there, I'm going to suggest that I think we have to frame a recommendation in this way, and you'll tell us if I'm wrong, Claire, that the executive member consider reviewing the council tree policy with the objective of making it simpler to plant trees or clearer for organisations how they can plant trees. Yes, Dave.
I would suggest it's probably more about expanding the policy than reviewing it, because there's things you referred to that are not probably covered.
Oh, right, okay.
In the detail that you're aspiring to.
Do you think we need a tree strategy? Do you think we need a tree strategy, and then with that review the policy to see if it marries up to and aligns with the tree strategy? So we have something that states our ambition about how we're going to increase our canopy cover across urban and woodland planting, and then through that how we work, the kind of advice and guidance we give partners and private sector, private residents and developers around meeting that target.
I think there's multiple themes of work there. The current tree strategy is really about how the council deals with its own trees.
Yeah.
And I think that could be expanded to deal with the point you made about advising, say, ward committees or local residents how they can increase the council's tree stock. That would then sit within a wider tree strategy.
Yeah. Okay.
So I'm not 100% clear right now. James has said we've got a tree policy. Do we actually currently have a tree strategy, or is that something that we need to have?
I would say we have a policy for how the council looks after its own trees.
Yeah. But we don't have a tree strategy that is about meeting the wider target of the canopy cover, and we don't have any real guidance that would help residents or private individuals think about what they need to do to plant trees. Would that be fair, do you think, Dave and James? Sorry.
I think you need to go and read the tree policy. I think you need a report here to look at the tree policy, and Scrutiny needs to do a piece of work on the tree policy as a starting point, rather than referring it to the executive member. I think you need to do a piece of work here to look at the tree policy. It talks about community involvement, it talks about replacement trees. So I think you need to have a look at it in that context and decide whether you
and then put it
what your recommendations are to the executive member, rather than you're almost asking the executive member to do a piece of scrutiny, whereas actually the scrutiny should happen here.
How do members feel about that? Does that seem like a good idea? Yeah. Yes. Well, it's certainly come clear reading this that there is a gap, and in the months ahead, the clouds will clear and the committee will start again. And it would seem that there's general support for the idea that that should be one of the items on the work plan. Yes.
I just wanted to highlight, obviously with the election, it would be a recommendation that the committee or some version of the committee, if anything's changed, considers adding it to their work plan to look at it, rather than it being something that we could actually put on there, because obviously it might change.
I'll let you devise the form of words that will let us all sleep easy tonight without fear. Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for presentation. Thank you, Sean. Okay. So we're now doing adaptations, agenda item 6, isn't it? Yes. A 5-minute comfort break for everyone. It is a fully charged agenda today. Okay, so we'll start again at 28 minutes past. Oh, well. Welcome back. So we're now moving on to the next agenda item, which is agenda item 6, climate change strategy, strengthening York's resilience to climate change. And I think you're going to introduce it, Claire. Yeah.
That's right. Thank you, Chair. So I'll introduce it and then I'll hand over to Steve Ragg, our flood resilience manager, risk manager, apologies, to talk about a quite incredible project that's happening upstream. So before we get on to that, just to remind you all that the climate change strategy is about both reducing carbon so that we can reach net zero, and also how we plan to adapt to climate incidences as they become more prevalent. I want to just draw your attention, if I may, to paragraph 8 in the report. It actually sets out the urgency that we're currently facing. So in York, in 2022, York experienced the hottest day ever, recorded at 38 degrees centigrade, exceeding estimates for the hottest summer day of 35.6 degrees centigrade if global average temperatures increased to 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So we talk about the climate emergency as if it's something in the future. Actually, we're already experiencing it now. Adaptation is about preparing for that emergency. It's about making sure that the unprecedented heat and then 6 months later, some of the lowest temperatures we've experienced, the infrastructure, the systems and the policies that support this city are ready for those changes. The council motion in October 21 set out that a adaptation strategy and understanding the York's climate resilience would need to be set against the UK's climate change risk assessment framework. Since then, we've experienced, as I said, the summer heat waves breaking all records. We've also started learning from the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Change Commission programme, which has taken a regional perspective to understand climate risk, which recommends drawing on the Met Office framework for climate risk. We've also recognised there's a significant impact on our workforce, not least through the heatwave last year, that the health and well-being of certain groups of residents are at significant risk, particularly the elderly and the youngest, and that there are adverse social effects identified by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. As I've said before, Steve Ragg is already leading the way, and his team with partners to adapt to flood risk. However, our gaps are in particular heat, extreme cold, and then water insecurity as a result of drought. The Yorkshire and Humber Climate Change Programme that we're now working with takes a regional perspective. It recognises, as Professor Jeffrey said earlier, that climate change knows no boundaries. The climate change programme set out by the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission describes a roadmap that will lead us to a strategy, an action plan, which we will cost, and then identify adaptations, whether through new investment from external sources, particularly central government working as a regional whole, or making better use of the current investment and funding we already have. It's worth noting as well that we've had advice recently prior to the report, once the report had been published, from CDP that recognised that our A rating, to retain our A rating, we would need to demonstrate more progress on adaptation going forward. It's currently noted in the climate change strategy in 4 different objectives, and we will need to show progress against all 4 of those. Our recommended next steps are to finalise our climate risk resilience report for York and publish it so that everyone is aware of the types of risk affecting York and what that might mean for individuals, communities and businesses. To work with the region through the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission adaptation programme to deliver the climate and adaptation strategy and action plan by the end of this year. And then to look really carefully at the funding opportunity, recognising the cost of doing nothing now will mean more significant costs in the future. So before we move on to the discussion, I'd just like to bring Steve Ragg in to talk about the adaptation programme that's taking place for our flooding. Obviously, York is well known as an area that floods, and there are significant activity and investment taking place to try and mitigate that risk going forward. Can I just hand over to Steve?
Thank you, Claire. Good evening, everyone. The slide pack is purposely quite small because this is really just an example of one of the approaches that's within the wider report that Claire's just delivered there. More than happy to discuss this much wider at any future date. So I think would be a really useful thing to do so. This is a project that's one of DEFRA's 25 projects, DEFRA funded projects, 25 projects around the country, which is their flood resilience innovation programme. So we were lucky enough to bid and receive funding for this programme of works. The slide pack talks through the context of this. There's an example there of the rise in river levels over the years from late 1800s there through to present day. And you know, as we all know, you know, we're seeing more and more frequent flooding, not just here in York, but elsewhere around the region and elsewhere. It's a huge catchment upstream of York, 3,500 square kilometres, the rivers Swale, Ure and Nid. And we've also got some significant changes at the minute in the way in which land is managed, and farmers who are businesses, let's not forget that, are supported in the work that they do. Changed from the EU farming subsidies through to ELMS, Environment Land Management System, which will help incentivise farmers to diversify and deliver wider outcomes from their land. So what is our project? Well, there's a whole range of partners, you can see in the second slide there, that are already up and involved in the project. It's been going for just over a year now. A lot of work in bringing together all of the various governance and partnering arrangements that are in place. 5 years up until 2027, £6 million in investment. What are we trying to do? The third slide shows that. To better understand how land management can have a positive influence on reduced flood risk downstream. We already know this, in that there's a lot of work already happened elsewhere, and also within this catchment, in how you can change the way in which we replace moorland gripping, afforestation and the upper margins, and a whole series of work around interventions called natural flood management, NFM, which is something that's emerging rapidly. I've been involved in flood risk all of my professional career, and you know, we've really gone from looking at the river channel through to looking at the whole catchment. So things like marginal planting, about just changing the direction in which you plough the fields, through to other features that store, you know, ponds and swales and wetlands, all have a positive way of reducing either the water that gets into the watercourse because it's lost to the ground, or actually slowing it down and causing a positive benefit downstream. So there's a big piece of work that we're doing over the next couple of years in modelling all of that across that catchment. This is, you know, unprecedented scale of modelling to try to look at these natural flood risk management measures. So we've engaged flood risk modellers who have started that process now, but that work will really start to materialise over the next 18 months towards 2 years. Engagement of communities. So we're working predominantly with Natural England and the Yorkshire Dales Rivers Trust. And we're utilising their existing networks to inject further boots on the ground. So more farm advisory officers, a programme coordinator, to actually start to talk to land managers and farmers to find out what the opportunities are out there to actually develop some of these features more, to try to incentivise the uptake of these measures. And then active engagement to try to link those that can to those that need, those that have the land and those that have the flood risk impacts, whether that's in North Yorkshire communities and villages who are directly impacted by some of the flows from these catchments, or downstream in York, where the aggregation of all of these benefits will deliver a future climate change sponge above and beyond the interventions that we've already got in the city, the flood defences that we've seen renewal in some wards of councillors in this room over the last few years. So the benefits, so they're summarised there. I've just really touched on those: reducing flood risk in rural communities, community helping downstream flooding in York, but lots and lots of environmental benefits. You know, if we can work with farmers to hold water back on their land, it also holds the nutrients back on their land. I mean, nutrients and all of the soil health benefits that would come from this work is just unparalleled in the potential outcomes that we could gain from that. Support farmers and land managers through a time of change. How can we help them to manage the impacts of global, national impacts and issues that they're experiencing all the time? And building flood risk management capacity into catchment organisations. In the past, a lot of these interventions have come because they've been biodiversity or species or ecosystem-led benefits, which is fantastic. And flood risk has really always been a secondary benefit. We're trying to bring it to the fore where we really understand how these benefits can deliver in pounds, shillings and pence flood benefits to those downstream, so it can become a core weapon, not just for us as flood risk managers, but for other catchment organisations. So the ambition there is a summary there of what we're doing. So we're influencing the long-term direction of the catchments, using the evidence to influence catchment decisions and standing funding opportunities. This collaborative approach, and it's really great that it's been taken up and with gusto and real appetite from all of our partners across the catchment. There's a lot of work to be done here, and it's stretching, it's ambitious. It is within an innovation programme. But the last one of the things that we've said there as well, we're looking to try to create a legacy, that what comes out of this after April 2027, and we talked earlier on, didn't we, about the devolved administration, and you know, we'll suddenly be having you know, a catchment scale set of local government governance and administration. Well, that's the scale that Water's managed at, you know, to protect us here in York and our neighbours in North Yorkshire. So we're looking to try to create a legacy here. And I can't remember where it says in the slide because I'm looking up and not looking at the slides, but we're working directly with DEFRA on this to actually influence national policy, national funding opportunities, not just what we're doing within the catchment. So hopefully another big outcome from this will be that we'll, you know, have a long-term influence on how natural flood risk management is managed across a catchment scale, not just here in York, but elsewhere. Thanks.
Fantastic, thank you for that. Yet again, we're on an agenda item that's huge and has a lot of impacts. So did I see Councillor Colwick, you wanted to come in first?
Steve, thank you for that, and very clear and encouraging. Are there any areas in which you're finding any resistance? What are there any? Where are your difficulties? Where are your challenges? It sounds like it's all going swimmingly well. If that's not the right expression, forgive me. But what's challenging you?
Yeah, we're not yet at that scale of saying, you know, in this particular part of a subcatchment of the Swale or the Ure that we're finding the challenges yet. But our partners, the Rivers Trust and Natural England and the Nidderdale AOMB, they've already got a really good understanding of where there's the appetite for this. And we need to move it away from land managers and farmers who are already open to these ideas. They're already open to diversification and doing things differently. We've already got those on board. The issue is how do you get it to others who are a little bit more blinkered about those potential wider environmental, wider climate mitigation adaptation benefits, and that they can bring that on board to their core way of thinking. Up in the upper catchments where you've got marginal farming already, sheep farming and the like, that's very difficult. The margins are quite narrow for a lot of these farmers. It's a little bit easier in some of those environments. Plus, you can also illustrate the flood risk benefits a little bit better than very, very steep side of valleys, running down to communities downstream. It kind of the narratives there already. The bigger challenges will be when we start to get to the middle of the catchment, some of the wider arable areas and some of the more intensive farms, and trying to disrupt that a little bit. That's where the challenges be. And we've seen it elsewhere in Yorkshire. There's a really good community of practice across Yorkshire looking at natural flood management, and we're part of that. We're part of the setup and delivery of that as well. So we've seen it elsewhere. It's not particular just to us, and also we're partnering with colleagues across in Cumbria as part of the innovation programme. So we're learning from what's happening with others. That's where the challenges will be. One of the other challenges will be, it's slightly off to the side of your question, but I think it's all bound in. Whilst it's a period of opportunity with the EU farming subsidies going out one way and the government's variant of that, ELMS, coming in, whilst that's an opportunity, it's potentially a little bit of a threat that we might see some farmers and land managers saying, we really like your project, Steve, it's fantastic, but we'll just wait to see what government's going to bring to the table. And that's a potential threat as well. But we're hoping to use it more as an opportunity than a threat. That's the way that we're really facing this up.
Thank you for that. I have a few responses. While you're speaking there, Steve, it just made me think, I sit on the internal drainage board, and we get problems with individual farmers opposing even something as simple as cutting the grass on one bank and not the other, and alternating in order to protect biodiversity. And some farmers just say, no, cut both sides. I want to see it all tidy. And all of those channels that they're dealing with are part of this business of how we manage water in the years ahead. So I suppose I'm saying, I'm hoping that you'll be able to get through to those voices that essentially, I think my experience is that they're quite marginalized and quite far away from the discussions that we're having here. And there's a whole educational communication project required to get people engaged and involved. And the other thing, well, the two other things struck me while you were speaking. One was you were talking about flood management and resilience and stuff, and it suddenly made me think of a film I made in Malmo, in the area called Augustenberg, where they have huge problems with flooding and have had for a long time. They've got the largest green roof in Europe on their council building. And they've got a fantastic project in all the council housing of channeling water, of creating ponds to catch water so that it can evaporate later. And it just made me think of all those opportunities that we have. My feeling is we have yet to explore here. So I was heartened by what you'd said. And the last point, and then I'll shut up, is I hope that in the assembly of this strategy and this looking at infrastructure, that we properly quantify the cost of what needs to be done. Over the past 4 years, one of the things that struck me over and over again is that we seem to be second guessing how much we think there is in somebody's pot. And we say, well, we'd like 7 million quid's worth, that'll help us on our way. And we never actually articulate the fact that when we've sat around the table and thought properly about it, we know there's a need for £500 million. We see it in housing, where we know that we've got 80,000 houses. If they all cost 30 grand to retrofit, that's 2 billion there. And I think we've got the same here, I suspect, with infrastructure, with agriculture, with protecting electricity supply, with protecting water and drainage to people's homes, all of those things. And I hope that you'll be telling me that you think we are ready, we have those figures, and that it's probably about political will to say, we're not scared of saying this. We want to actually be clear about the scale of the challenge and have all the plans on a shelf so that government sees us genuinely as people who can deliver. It would just good to have your thoughts as to whether you think we are there or we're not there, or what we'd need to do.
Thank you, Chair. So 3 very good, well-made observations. IDBs, we're surrounded on all 4 sides by IDBs, as you know, and I sit on all the boards as well. And they are influential on the way in which we have rural waters coming into our urban fabrics. And I agree with your comments. It can sometimes be difficult to illustrate those wider biodiversity and habitats and other issues with the IDBs. They are moving forward a little bit. We're talking about biodiversity action plans, aren't we, again, in this round of meetings with them. And I think, as we start to illustrate things through this project, it will become very difficult to really question the sort of things that were coming out from this project. So we'll try to take them along with us. But IDBs only represent, I think it's 16% of areas around the country in England. And the Swell, Ure and Nid catchment, we do have a few more up towards the Thirsk area. But again, when you look at that 3,500 square kilometres, they're a small percentage of the catchment area. So although we will be able to bring them with us, hopefully, their impact is less important. But I think that thinking, that mindset exists outside of IDBs as well. So that's the bigger challenge. And I think that's going back a little bit more towards Councillor Cullick's question. Malmo, I use pictures from Malmo in all my presentations. Not all of them, but quite a few of them. Fantastic. Sustainable drainage.
Yeah.
You know, the way they approach it over there is fantastic. We do have within the National Planning Policy Framework presumption in favour of SUDs. One of my teams sits permanent with planners, and we do get some fantastic, as you know, as you'll see in planning, we do get some fantastic outcomes. But it's widely recognised in England that it's not that the weaponry we have is not as strong as it should be. Back in 2014, there was an opportunity within the Flood and Water Management Act to bring in really quite rigorous guidelines and secondary and primary legislation regarding SUDs. And government backed off at that time and reinforced the National Planning Policy Framework. Just last month, beginning of January, government announced after a review, and we fed into the review, and colleagues around the country fed into the review, that they will enact the part of the Flood and Water Management Act regarding sustainable drainage that wasn't enacted back then. And what that will be is it will seriously beef up how we work with developers in getting SUDs into new developments. Even to the point of we, you know, as a lead local flood authority, we will be expected to adopt those features once they've been built. So there will need to be a new burdens assessment, a cradle to grave assessment of how you go from the design, the implementation, and then the long-term adoption and maintenance of them. It will be very difficult to get in place, not just for us, but for the other 140 odd local authorities that are classed as lead local flood authorities. But it's the right thing to do, and it'll take us a little bit closer to the likes of Malmo. That will be sometime next year. The announcement was last month. Again, that might be something that's really useful to come back to this committee or whatever variants. So a good question, well made, and hopefully we'll be stepping further with that. Cost and funding. This is one of the big issues of natural flood management, in that it's very easy, well, not easy, but it's easy in a very technical and difficult way to assess a raised defence like North Street or Clementhorpe or wherever it may be, to calculate the costs of putting in an intervention and the benefits that it will derive through, a reduction in flood risk damages to people and property and businesses. But it's really difficult to do that for natural flood management. If you put in place leaky debris dams, natural barriers, swales and ponds in the rural environment, how much will that reduce the flow going forward? And then at what point will those benefits be realised downstream? There is some science around that, but it's emerging. Our project, with its 2 years of modelling, and we've already developed a prototype way in which we could distribute funding as part of this project for demonstration sites, and DEFRA are really keen on that. That will start to square that circle a little bit more for natural flood management. And it will mean that we'll say, if we're going to achieve this, this is the scale of intervention that's needed, and this is the funding that would need to go with it. And then we try to bring in all the various potential funding streams. We've been talking to people at the university in the last few months about potential ways that you could get commercial businesses to come on board and say, well, actually, if that would safeguard that area of farming better, we'd be interested. Never mind national funding pots, pure flood risk funding pots, farming subsidies and the like. So that will be the key to our project. We're not there yet. And the industry is a long way short of that. But that's a big part of what we're trying to achieve.
And is that in terms of resilience for the one thing you've not mentioned in on all of that is resilience to things like substations, electricity, to sewage and water and those kind of infrastructure things. And you can also you can add to that bridges and roads so that people can actually get around. Presumably at some point all of that has got to be brought into this as well.
Yeah, and again, so Treasury Green Book rules and DEFRA's flood defence partnership grant and aid funding has brought that in over the last few years, more about infrastructural resilience. we have got the opportunity with this project to do exactly the same with this level and scrutiny of modelling that's in place. We can do the same. It's not just the receptors and not just people and property. It is all of those other things as well.
And I think, Claire, when you introduced it, you mentioned the CDP report, isn't it? I always mix it up, CDP, CPD.
CDP.
And the fact that we've got an A rating, but there is a vulnerability on this particular area. How long do we have to prepare the documentation, not just to please them, because obviously at the end of the day, the whole point of this is not to keep Sir happy, but it's to demonstrate that to ourselves that we're putting in place the things we have to have.
So they'll be looking for their next submission in July, and what they're looking for is progress against an approach to managing the city around adaptation. So we've got a really strong story, obviously, around flooding. And we will be a significant way through the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission adaptation programme by then, because that concludes in December. So we can demonstrate progress against understanding York's specific, sorry, I can't say the word, specific climate risks from heat, water insecurity, extreme cold and flooding. Will be a significant way along the way of working with partners. So we've established a task and finish group working group with partners to understand their own particular risks. We've got an internal group established which looks at our own internal risks, particularly around workforce and working in extreme conditions. So we'll be some of the way along, actually demonstrating how we're following a route map that will lead to a adaptation strategy and a costed action plan, and where the funding might come from. But in the meantime, the kind of shorter term measures that we're putting in place to prepare for any summer heat waves, etc.
And we've heard a lot about Yorkshire and Humber. For us in York, going forwards, it's the combined authority. It's how we play a leadership role there. How does that fit with what you've both been describing? Are we organising ourselves at the moment in a way that we will be able to engage purposefully and in a leadership way at combined authority level?
So from a broad for the non-flooding weather events, we have to remember, of course, that the Office of Police and Fire Commission are moving into the Mayoral Combined Authority, and we have North Yorkshire Police and North Yorkshire Fire, and both of them have a vested interest in making sure that we adapt, particularly the fire service around use of tenders and rural fires and the impact that fire has on urban accommodations and whether resourced and able to cope, essentially. So yes, absolutely, working at a regional level is the only way we can absolutely prepare for climate risk. And the reason that we're part of the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission programme is because so are North Yorkshire. So we're walking together on this pathway to deliver adaptation strategy and action plan. And then over to Steve.
And from a flood risk point of view, the very architecture of this project is congruent to the devolved administration type area. It's opened a pathway and a linkage between us and North Yorkshire that wasn't there before, and that we're trying to manage things at a catchment scale, and the environment is really keen on that. We've got some strong partnerships that, especially over in the east in Hull and the East Riding, the Living with Water partnership across there. This is the precursor for something along those lines. How it would fit with governance, administration, and etc. of a devolved administration is still to be determined, and I think there's potentially some more thorny issues going forward. In the first gestation of that administration than this, but it shows that we're already working together nicely. And when the time comes for us to work out how that exists at that administrative level, I think we'll hopefully be in a good place.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear. So are there any other comments? Not seeing any. I'll end it by saying I can remember maybe 3 years ago, we were talking about flooding in York and where you would put your money and where you should put your trees. And we were talking at that time, well, wouldn't it be great if we were planting thousands of trees 30 miles upstream so that they could be stopping the flood from ever coming down to us? And it seems like what we're discussing here is very much tied up with that whole concept, and that working regionally, we're getting close to a place where we'll be able to do that.
Yeah, Steve's got some incredibly innovative examples that are beyond just tree planting. So I wonder if it is worth, or not worth, but it'd be valuable to the group to bring him back and be a bit more sort of tactical about some of the things you're doing with, try not to think of it as the Beaver project, but the sort of natural engineering of the natural landscape.
Absolutely, from me. Yeah.
Can we make a note of that as well for coming forward? Because one of the challenges for all of us as councillors is the need to learn and to have access to information to help shape our thinking as we go forward. So that would be a really great idea. I'd welcome that if I were here. Who knows? Okay, well, thank you very much. We move on to our last agenda item, which is agenda item 7, Verge wildflowering.
It's late actually to get, but I think we're only 3 members, we're no longer quorum.
Oh, right, okay.
I'm pretty sure it's 4 to be quorum.
I'm one too, aren't I? So that's 1, 2, 3, 4.
No.
Oh no, sorry, it's just 3. Sorry, I'm Sean. I was throwing you into a camp that. Yeah, okay.
So we should be fine to look at the item, but we won't be able to.
We won't be able to.
Sort of recommendation,
Okay.
anything like that.
Okay. So in a sense, we can all relax, and in another sense, we can't, because it's as important as all the other things.
Thank you, Chair. What we've brought together is a feedback on 4 projects that have taken place over the last couple of years. I know one of them is very dear to your heart, and thank you from an officer point of view. Thank you for your leading of that project. I think for me, the key, each project has been quite different, which is nice because it demonstrates a different way of achieving this sort of common aim of increasing the grassland space for pollinators. So as the report sets out, there's the Weldrake, very rural Verge, where engagement with the local farming community was key, and the ability to bring in both expert volunteer assistance and more localized volunteer labour. Hall Road, Field Lane roundabout area, where the ward committees paid for work by the Trust for Conservation Volunteers. So very much a contracted, small scale specific project. Moving on to one which is run by the service ourselves, where we tried some seasonal flower mix on the central reservation, running out past the really from B&Q and up to the Parkinson Bar Park and Ride site. And one a sort of fine tune of a very more complex area down by the Millennium Bridge, where the council for a number of years has been doing differential mowing, and the community have looked after one part of it. And through sponsorship by the ward committee and additional funds that St Nick's brought in, they developed a sort of grassland mowing by siding, and trained volunteers up to do that work. So quite a range of approaches with a common goal. So for me, the end is that under the lessons learned section in how we go forward, which is summarised at the start as to some of the factors that people need to take into consideration. So obviously very key to have a bottom-up ward-led approach in York. Selection of your site is crucial. It's not applicable to, unfortunately, many locations, but where it is right, you can make quite a considerable difference. I mentioned money with a previous paper today, but again, that's key to particularly the future, as well as the local leadership of it. And finally, we do still want to try and manage the impact on pollinators. Again, as previous meeting I've mentioned, we are investing in some pollinator monitoring. So where those council sites are suitable, we will be putting in the monitors. And I'm not fully up to speed with the scheme, but we are trying to get an option to get these pollinators out to the wider community.
I think just from a scrutiny perspective, just to bring it back to the sort of policy and decision making. So the policy context is obviously one underlying highway safety where we're looking at planting highway verges, but then it's led by the pollinator strategy, which we looked at a couple of weeks ago, possibly a month ago now. And the pollinator strategy makes clear that it's just a bottom-up community-led approach, and that's obviously detailed in the annexes where the guidance has been produced and circulated to all ward councillors and community groups, and that's sort of how the funding for it comes forward. And as Dave said, I think there are lessons to learn. I think the ongoing maintenance is a factor. You know, the fact that we tend to sit on very fertile soils means that people's classic sort of picture of what a wildflower area looks like obviously isn't realised in York, because we've got some of the most fertile soils in the north of England. So it requires ongoing management and maintenance. And I think the other piece of work is one where we would accept that our systems within public realm probably need to be improved in terms of how we maintain areas. So we've got better knowledge of what's going out into sites, and then we can communicate that to our workforce where they have made mistakes. And that, you know, I would apologise to them here because they've taken the blame for stuff which is about management instruction. So I think we can improve our systems in that regard as well.
Thank you to you both for that. Yeah, my response to this is that I think the bottom-up approach is useful, but what I have certainly learned from the past 2.5 years with the Wheldrake Verge is the absolute value of forming partnerships with conservation organisations like the Yorkshire Wildlife Trust or Natural England, local nature reserves, to bring in the expertise that can do what you've both alluded to there, which is the challenge is maintaining these things. It's easy to set something up and go, what clever people we are. Making them work is a challenge. And in terms of the finance, what's also really clear is the opportunity is there if we work with partnerships. Because actually what you've just referred to, James, about the richness of the land that we're dealing with, the biggest challenge for the Wheldrake Verge is removing the arisings to try and bring the fertility of the soil down. And that's not something that's easily done with volunteers. But I see going forwards a massive potential for the City Council to work with the conservation groups, with the Internal Drainage Board and others to purchase equipment that can remove arisings from the verge. And then the question that follows from that is, where does all that stuff go? And that's a project that can't be done in a local community at community level. It's about anaerobic digesters. It's about bigger stuff. And so I welcome what we've achieved in the past 3 years. As with previous things we've discussed, I think for the future, Scrutiny will need to look at how we deal with those arisings in a way that's constructive, helps to cover the costs. I don't know if you can generate money from an aerobic digestion. That might be a step too far, but managing reducing the fertility of the soil, I think, is critical to making progress on this. I don't know if Ben's got anything to add either. I'm sorry, James. Yeah.
I was just going to say there are obviously options for what we do with green arisings. Most of the city's green arisings are just turned straight to compost. They don't go to an AD.
Yeah. Are there any other comments? Yeah.
Thank you for this, and thank you for the contribution you've made, Chair. I might have missed it, but there's no reference that I've spotted to dealing with non-native invasive species in this process. Is that something to be concerned about? I'd just like to hear whether it's been an issue.
Not in this context.
Yeah.
You've got invasive native species as well, so it's not necessarily non-native, and there are defined weeds under various pieces of legislation. And in particular, we have a Japanese knotweed contract to treat that, and it's what used to be near Millennium Bridge Field. But the successful treatment of that over about 3 years, it's either gone or greatly reduced. So we do have a regular treatment program. And the other weed we will address with a degree of urgency is giant hogweed. So where the public will report that, either our staff or our contractor will remove it, as quick as practical possible.
I'd like to say, I mean, in closing this really, it's how quickly nature recovers if we give it space. The Weldrake wildflower verge was essentially, if you'd seen it, just some grass that was cut every now and then by adjoining landowners. And in the first year, we counted 45 wildflower species when we just left it, including rare bee orchids that people were coming from a long way to see because it's a beautiful and strange thing. In that first year, we had harvest mice in a verge. They're a rare species. In the second year, we've had, I think I counted, about 55 wildflower species. And they were spreading, in spite of the fact that we've not been able to remove the arisings the way we'd want. And if there's, that's a message of hope to me. If we can change the way we do things, nature can come back. And given the way in which agriculture has changed with the removal of the set aside around fields because of a loss of funding, this rural verge network, and in the cities as well, is critical to biodiversity, to pollinators, to creating the bee corridors and all the other stuff. And I always remind myself that, I'm not terribly, we talk about carbon dioxide a lot. Actually, fundamentally, I'm not terribly interested in carbon dioxide. My motivation is I want to protect and cherish the world that we all love. And so sometimes biodiversity can seem as a little add-on. No, we should be talking seriously about carbon dioxide. Now, there's a point to all of this. And even on a fragile verge, we can see what happens if we start doing the right thing. So thank you for the report. I hope that going forwards, we keep on and we find new ways of developing on this. And that's everything. And to conclude, thank you to everyone for all the work you've done over the past few years. To those of us who've managed to stay to the bitter end, to those who've had to leave, a lot of our agendas have been very packed because the subject we're dealing with is massive. It impacts on absolutely everything. And with the best will in the world, meeting it was once a month at the start, it's now once every 9 or 10 weeks. To try and move this agenda is difficult. So thank you to everybody for the work that's been done.
And on behalf of members present and not present, thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.
That